They say every legend has his secrets. And for Chuck D, the voice of Public Enemy, the man who turned hip-hop into a weapon of truth, those secrets aren't about his past, but about his enemies. For decades, he stood on stages across the world demanding justice, teaching lessons, and calling out the system. But behind the microphone, there were certain artists he could never respect. Now, for the first time, that list has surfaced. And it's not filled with the names you'd expect. These aren't small feuds or one-off disagreements. These are the rappers Chuck D believed betrayed the very spirit of hip-hop. The ones who, in his eyes, traded truth for profit, culture for commerce, and revolution for radio spins. Some became chart-topping icons. Some turned their fame into empires. But to Chuck, their rise symbolized hip-hop's decline, proof that the industry had stolen a movement and repackaged it as entertainment. And as you'll see, the deeper we go down this list, the more it becomes clear. Chuck D wasn't just naming rappers. He was naming a system. So let's begin. At number 5, we start with a rapper who once ruled the early 2000s. A man who turned his scars into superstardom, but in Chuck D's eyes, became the first crack in hip-hop's foundation. That man is 50 Cent. For millions of fans, Get Rich or Die Tryin' wasn't just an album, it was an anthem. But for Chuck D, 50 Cent symbolized something very different. To him, 50 wasn't the hero of hip-hop. He was the warning sign that rap was drifting too far from its roots. Chuck D's problem with 50 wasn't personal beef in the traditional sense. It wasn't a clash of egos or a battle over lyrics. It was ideological. Chuck, who came up in the 1980s with Public Enemy, had built his career on the idea that hip-hop was a weapon of truth, a tool to wake people up, to speak against racism, poverty, and political injustice. Like he once said in an interview, the real gangsters are the government.
They play gangsters, the real gangsters are government.
But when he looked at 50 Cent's rise, he saw a dangerous shift. In his eyes, the industry had taken a man with an undeniably compelling story surviving 9 bullets, hustling his way out of Queens, and turned him into a product. The violence, the gangsta image, the non-stop feuds weren't just part of 50's reality, they were marketed as entertainment. And that, to Chuck, was everything wrong with hip-hop in the 2000s. Publicly, Chuck never minced words. In interviews and discussions, he argued that rappers like 50 Cent weren't leading the youth, they were distracting them. Instead of focusing on systemic problems, kids were being sold violence, materialism, and a fantasy of power that, in Chuck's opinion, only benefited record labels and corporations. He once criticized mainstream rap of that era as hip-hop being hijacked by the hustlers, and it was clear who he had in mind. But here's the twist, Chuck didn't deny 50 Cent's talent. In fact, he often said that artists like him had the ability to inspire something bigger. The frustration came from watching that potential get funneled into destructive imagery. For Chuck, 50 was proof that the industry had taken control of the narrative. Instead of rappers pushing for social change, they were now trapped in a cycle of beefs and billionaire branding wars. And make no mistake, Chuck called out the system just as much as the man. He didn't hate Curtis Jackson the person as much as he hated what the industry made him stand for. The face of hip-hop is spectacle. To Chuck, it was like watching a movement get repackaged into a reality show where violence and drama overshadowed the original message. This is why Chuck D put 50 Cent on his most hated list. Not because he denied his grind, not because he ignored his cultural impact, but because to him, 50 represented the hijacking of hip-hop's soul. The very thing Chuck and Public Enemy had fought so hard to preserve in the 80 seconds and 90 seconds, the idea that rap could be revolutionary, was now, in his view, being drowned out by corporate noise. And just when you think that's the harshest critique Chuck could give, it gets even more personal as we climb higher on the list. Because next up, at number 4, Chuck D turned his attention to an artist who, unlike 50 Cent, wasn't just shaped by the industry, he was shaping it himself. At number 4, we step into the world of Kanye West, and this one isn't simple. Because when it comes to Kanye, the story isn't black and white. It's a storm, a spectacle, a constant tug of war between brilliance and chaos. On one hand, you have a man who reshaped hip-hop forever. On the other, you have the very reason Chuck D looked at the 2000s and said, "This isn't what we fought for." Imagine it. The year is 2004. Hip-hop is dominated by gangster rap, and in comes Kanye the college dropout with a pink polo and a backpack. He's not rapping about hustling on the streets. He's rapping about faith, insecurity, materialism, and dreams. His debut album felt like fresh air, and Chuck D, the activist who spent decades begging for hip-hop to push deeper messages, should have been thrilled. For a moment, maybe he was. Jesus Walks echoed the same spirit Public Enemy once carried. But here's where the twist comes, and Kanye couldn't stay in the shadows. He wanted the spotlight and then some. As his fame grew, so did his ego, and Chuck saw it happening in real time. Graduation, 808s, and Heartbreak, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy masterpieces, no doubt. But in Chuck's eyes, each album was less about hip-hop as a movement and more about Kanye as a myth. The stage got bigger, the stunts got louder, and suddenly, it wasn't about the message anymore. It was about the man. Take the 2009 MTV VMA incident, Kanye storming the stage, snatching the mic from Taylor Swift. For fans, it was outrageous, funny, unforgettable. For Chuck D, it was the perfect example of what he hated most: hip-hop stars being reduced to circus acts. The culture was built on fighting oppression, Chuck once said, not on fighting for attention. And that line could have been written directly for Kanye. But here's where the story gets darker. Kanye didn't just stop at music or media antics. He started bending politics, history, even faith into shock value headlines. Meeting Donald Trump at the White House in a MAGA hat, saying slavery sounded like a choice, running a chaotic presidential campaign. For Chuck, this wasn't just Kanye being Kanye. This was dangerous. It was the weaponization of influence. Millions of fans were watching, repeating, debating every word he said. And in Chuck's eyes, that power was being wasted, or worse, used to divide. And yet here's the contradiction that makes Kanye such a fascinating pick. Chuck D never denied the genius. He admitted Kanye could have been the one, the artist with the power to pick up the torch of political hip-hop and run further than anyone else. But instead, Kanye turned the torch into a spotlight, pointing it at himself. To Chuck, that wasn't evolution, it was betrayal. Think of it this way. Chuck D once called hip-hop the CNN of the streets, a tool to broadcast the truth. Kanye, with all his reach, could have been the next global anchor of that message. Instead, he became the headline, the drama, the distraction. And Chuck hated distractions. So when Kanye landed at number 4 on Chuck's list, it wasn't about denying the music, the talent, or the legacy. It was about warning the culture. Don't confuse genius with leadership. Don't mistake spectacle for revolution. Kanye showed the world that hip-hop could go anywhere. But for Chuck D, it also proved that sometimes it could go too far. And if you think Kanye's ego was the biggest problem on this list, think again. Because the next name, at number 3, wasn't about chaos or controversy. To Chuck D, it was something far worse: calculated poisoning of the culture from the inside. At number 3, we have Jay-Z, the mogul, the rapper, the man who transformed hip-hop into a global empire. To most, he's untouchable, a billionaire, a cultural icon, a master of the game. But to Chuck D, Jay-Z represented a very different story. One of compromise, commercialization, and the subtle erosion of hip-hop's original purpose. It's easy to see why Chuck D had respect for Jay-Z. Hov is smart, strategic, and undeniably talented. He turned his music into a platform for influence. And his business ventures Rockefeller, Roc Nation, and everything beyond made him a pioneer in showing that rappers could control their own destinies. But that very success is what Chuck saw as the problem. Chuck D's issue wasn't just with Jay-Z's wealth or fame, it was with what that wealth symbolized. To Chuck, Jay-Z's journey reflected how hip-hop could be bent into a vehicle for personal gain rather than collective empowerment. Public Enemy's lyrics once demanded social awareness, a challenge to oppressive systems, a call to fight the power. Jay-Z, by contrast, had become the embodiment of hip-hop's corporate co-optation. He once said that Jay-Z wasn't speaking up for what is right.
I would tell him, I say, yo, y'all not speaking up for what's right.
The culture that had once been a platform for truth now seemed like a ladder to individual luxury. There was also the music itself. Jay-Z's lyrics, while clever and technically brilliant, often celebrated excess, wealth, and status over the activism and community consciousness Chuck D prized. Chuck respected lyricism, yes, but he saw the content as symptomatic of a deeper shift, the commercialization of struggle. The streets had always told real stories, but now those stories were being packaged, polished, and sold as aspirational fantasy. Jay-Z thrived in that system, and to Chuck, that made him complicit. The tension between Chuck and Jay-Z wasn't just about money or fame, it was about influence. Chuck had spent decades trying to use hip-hop as a weapon of truth, and now he saw artists like Jay-Z wielding their influence differently, shaping culture for personal branding, not public consciousness. He saw Jay-Z turning the streets into a marketplace for fashion lines, champagne brands, and luxury real estate, all while the social commentary of rap was fading from mainstream airwaves. And then there was the public perception. Jay-Z's iconic status made criticism difficult. To many fans, he was untouchable, a symbol of success and respectability. But Chuck D didn't let public opinion dictate his principles. He called out what he saw as betrayal, the hijacking of a cultural movement for personal gain. For Chuck, this wasn't just business, it was moral.
Forget the money. Money is made by the U.S. Net worth paper.
Hip-hop, in its roots, had a mission. Jay-Z had, intentionally or not, redirected that mission into commerce. Even the collaborations and partnerships Jay-Z fostered were a point of concern. From corporate sponsorships to political alignment, Chuck saw a careful crafting of image that prioritized profit over purpose. While the industry celebrated Jay-Z as a success story, Chuck saw a warning. A culture that once fought oppression was now being consumed by those very structures. So when Chuck D placed Jay-Z at number 3 on his list, it wasn't about disliking the man personally. It was about holding up a mirror to what hip-hop had become, a system that rewarded brilliance, yes, but at the cost of its soul. Jay-Z wasn't evil, Chuck believed, but he was part of a system that diluted the revolution. One luxury condo, one champagne brand, and one hit single at a time. And if you think the story ends there, it doesn't. Because as shocking as Jay-Z's influence was, the next name on Chuck D's list was someone whose very existence symbolized something far darker: the glorification of white supremacy in Hollywood itself. At number 2, Chuck D pointed directly at John Wayne.
See straight up racists that sucker with simple and plain.
At first glance, John Wayne might seem an odd inclusion on a rapper's most hated list. After all, the Duke wasn't dropping albums or rapping about street life. But to Chuck D, John Wayne symbolized something far more insidious: the glorification of racism and the erasure of black culture in American media. John Wayne was a hero of the silver screen. He was the rugged cowboy, the patriotic soldier, the face of classic Americana. Millions admired him, but Chuck D saw the man behind the legend: the interviews, the remarks, the subtle and not so subtle political statements. Wayne openly expressed racist views, often mocking Native Americans, black people, and others, while championing a singular, exclusionary vision of American history. For Chuck, Wayne's films weren't just entertainment, they were cultural indoctrination. The cowboy fantasies, the sanitized Wild West, the whitewashed versions of history, all of it sent a message that black people and other minorities were secondary, invisible, or even disposable in the story of America. And John Wayne, by way of his fame and influence, was the face of that narrative. To understand why Chuck D saw Wayne this way, you have to remember what Public Enemy stood for. Their music was never about escapism. It was about confrontation, a mirror held up to society's flaws, a demand for recognition of voices long silenced. Chuck knew that images mattered just as much as lyrics. A film can spread ideology just as easily as a rap record can, and when he looked at John Wayne's body of work, he saw a century of Hollywood shaping public memory in a way that erased the struggles and achievements of people of color. One of the most infamous examples comes from Wayne's own mouth, not just his movies. In a 1971 Playboy interview, he said he believed in white supremacy until responsibility was proven by black people, and he dismissed Native American suffering by claiming they were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. These weren't slips of the tongue, they were core beliefs, and they directly informed the heroic characters he portrayed on screen. Chuck D never forgot that. For him, it proved that the man behind the myth was every bit as damaging as the myth itself. It wasn't just the past that bothered Chuck, it was the legacy. Wayne's films continued to dominate the cultural imagination long after his death. Westerns, war movies, even merchandising the Duke's image remained untouchable, a symbol of America's nostalgia for a past that never treated everyone equally. And in Chuck's eyes, that made Wayne not just offensive, but dangerous. Because legends shape minds, and John Wayne's legend had shaped millions with a skewed, exclusionary view of history. The danger, as Chuck saw it, was that Wayne's image sanitized oppression. In Hollywood's hands, colonization became frontier heroism, racial hierarchy became patriotism, and the erasure of minorities became entertainment. And because Wayne was positioned as a national icon, this distorted narrative was normalized, passed down from one generation to the next without question. Fans and critics alike often debate whether Wayne's views were simply a product of his time. Chuck D didn't buy that excuse. To him, intent didn't matter as much as impact. The culture was still consuming Wayne's image, celebrating the very ideals that Public Enemy had spent decades challenging in music, speeches, and activism. Chuck D saw it as a betrayal not only of truth, but of progress. What good was the civil rights movement if the media continued to recycle old lies under the banner of nostalgia? And here's the irony Chuck highlighted. John Wayne was remembered as a hero by so many Americans, while countless black heroes who fought oppression were ignored or erased. How many schoolchildren knew about Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, or the black cowboys of the 19th century compared to John Wayne's characters? The imbalance was staggering. Public Enemy's mantra, "Fight the Power," wasn't just words, it was a call to confront exactly this kind of cultural glorification. Wayne embodied the system that glorified oppression while silencing those who resisted it. Chuck also understood that pop culture doesn't just reflect society, it directs it. The same way a Jay-Z song can shift trends or a Kanye outburst can dominate headlines, John Wayne's image helped define what it meant to be American. And if the model American was a rugged white cowboy who dismissed the experiences of minorities, then that image influenced policy, culture, and identity. This wasn't abstract to Chuck, it was lived reality. And Wayne was a glaring reminder of how culture could legitimize inequality. So when Chuck D put John Wayne at number 2, it wasn't a casual critique, it was a deliberate statement. Fame does not equal virtue, and cultural reverence does not absolve harm. To Chuck, Wayne's influence was a shadow over generations, a reminder of what happens when media prioritizes mythology over truth. And with that, we reach the pinnacle of Chuck D's most hated list. The man at number 1 isn't just controversial or divisive. He's an icon whose entire legacy Chuck D believes was built on erasing black culture and profiting from it. At number 1, the crown goes to Elvis Presley. He once dissed Elvis, saying Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me.
He's lying.
Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me.
Elvis's rise in the 1950s coincided with the birth of rock and roll, a genre deeply rooted in black music, blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues. These were the sounds that shaped the cultural landscape, yet as Chuck D points out, history chose to crown a white man as the king, while black pioneers like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe laid the foundation. Elvis was marketed as the face of a revolution he did not invent. To Chuck, this wasn't just a question of fairness, it was an affront to the very soul of American music. Public Enemy had spent decades fighting against the commercialization and cultural theft of black creativity. And Elvis's story was the ultimate example of that exploitation. The industry took the brilliance of black artists, sanitized it, and repackaged it for mass consumption, all while giving credit to someone who benefited from the system without acknowledging the origins of the art. But Chuck D's criticism of Elvis went beyond the cultural theft. It was about influence. Elvis was idolized by generations of fans worldwide. His every move, his style, his music, and even his persona became a blueprint for what the American dream in entertainment looked like, and that blueprint ignored the contributions of the very people who created the sound in the first place. To Chuck, this erasure was systemic, not accidental. And there's a personal element too. Chuck D grew up witnessing the power of music to awaken, challenge, and mobilize communities. He saw how hip-hop, rock, and soul could shape consciousness and spark dialogue about oppression. Elvis's fame, in Chuck's eyes, represented the opposite, a commercial triumph that overshadowed the voices of those who had struggled to create a platform for truth. The King's Crown was, in essence, a symbol of what happens when industry profits come before culture, history, and justice. Yet, Chuck D didn't dismiss Elvis entirely. He acknowledged the singer's talent and charisma, the ability to connect with an audience, the magnetic stage presence, the transformative effect on popular culture. But for Chuck, talent alone could not justify the broader impact. The erasure of black pioneers, the rewriting of musical history, and the celebration of a sanitized figurehead was unacceptable. Elvis, in Chuck's reckoning, was the most visible, most influential, and therefore most consequential symbol of that cultural theft. To Chuck D, placing Elvis at number 1 wasn't about personal animosity. It was a statement, a critique of how fame, race, and industry power can distort history and overshadow those who truly built the art form. It was a lesson, a warning, and a challenge to recognize the real roots of culture and to question the heroes we celebrate. And there it is, the full countdown. From 50 Cent at number 5 to Elvis Presley at number 1. Each name tells a story. Each represents a battle Chuck D has been fighting his entire life. The fight for truth, for respect, and for the soul of music. From contemporary rap to classic rock, from celebrity ego to cultural erasure, Chuck D's most hated list isn't just about dislike. It's a map of the betrayals he believes shaped the music world. And just when you think the story ends here, the debate begins. Because the question remains, do you agree with Chuck D's choices, or do you see these artists differently? Either way, the conversation he started is far from over.